Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 13th, 2022. Today I'm going to take a look at two examples of the desperate lunacy of the Anglo-American forces as the situation in Ukraine is moving out of their control, and they're thinking about how to extricate themselves out of that but continue to maintain their position as a rules-based order. There's growing recognition that Ukraine is losing. For example, the New York Times has published several articles recently, the most recent of which was one titled, "U.S. Lacks a Clear Picture of Ukraine's War Strategy." This was, I think, in Friday or Saturday's paper, and it follows a series of articles questioning the results of the resupply of Ukraine's army with weapons from the West. Another one of these articles was in The Guardian, which writes on Saturday, Ukraine's losses are about 20,000 soldiers per month now. They're running at that rate. And this is eroding its fighting strength. They're being hit by artillery bombardment in the Donbass. They're running out of Soviet-era weapons. There's a problem with NATO-US supplies. Namely, the Russians are apparently interdicting some of them and blowing them up before they can get to the Ukrainian army. And there's also growing dissatisfaction with Zelensky, as well as an exposure of the Nazis. Given this, there's a plan for a trip to Kiev by German Chancellor Scholz, Italian Prime Minister Draghi, and French President Macron, which is scheduled to take place sometime before the end of June, when there's a G7 meeting and there's a NATO meeting in Madrid. Maybe they're going to try to come up with some kind of evacuation plan or withdrawal from the fighting, but we'll see. Now, in the meantime, let me give you an insight into the kinds of lunacy that's being pushed at this point of potential desperation for the West. The first is a scheme concocted by the Royal United Services Institute. This is an agency which builds itself as, quote, the world's oldest and the UK's leading defense and security think tank, unquote. And its president is Prince Edward, the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth. On June 7th, they had a commentary titled, "From Freeze to Seize, Creativity and Nuance is Needed," unquote. This is on how to take the assets that have been frozen from Russia, over $300 billion worth of assets, and seize them, take them over. Not just freeze them, but take them. And this was followed on June 10th by an article titled, "The Complexity of Seizing Russia's Assets." Now, this was written by someone, one of the co-authors is the head of the think tank's Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies. Clearly, he's applying what he's learned about financial crime in this proposal. What they write is that they're going to need creativity or creative and nuanced proposals in order to figure out how to steal Russia's frozen assets. And they say they have to do this, quote, without inviting comparison with the autocracies the West supposedly stands against. Note they say supposedly stands against. And it goes on to say they don't want to hand the Russians a, quote, propaganda victory, which would occur if there was a court action declaring this illegal. So they say that there must be considerable creativity to come up with a scheme, quote, sufficiently robust to withstand scrutiny from a range of legal, moral, and human rights perspectives, unquotes. And they say the US, Canada, and the EU are working on bending the rules to allow it to occur, but they're not certain that they've come up with a strategy yet. They do have an idea, though, because they're looking at how you can use sanctions evasion as a legal way to seize assets. And this goes back to a European Union late May policy where they wrote a directive on asset recovery and confiscation. And so they're looking at a way that they can creatively nuance this so that money can be taken from the sanction evasion, and that way it would be totally acceptable to give the money to Ukraine. So here we see, on behalf of the British royal family, a scheme to seize money from a country. Now, keep in mind, this is at a point where there's growing concern with the security of assets in foreign banks by countries from all over the world. There was a seizure of $9 billion from Afghanistan, over $300 billion from Russia. The Chinese are beginning to move assets out of the U.S. banking system. Who can blame them? So the idea that somehow you can come up with a legal scam to freeze assets and then seize them is not going to endear the dollar system to countries which are looking for a way out. But this is what the British monarchy is up to right now, as they're fearful that Ukraine will turn into another Afghanistan, another fiasco. Now, at the same time, there's planning for the next war, and this is the war against China. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary from Raytheon, gave a speech at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue, which is not much of a dialogue, really, in which he accused China of a coercive and aggressive approach in Asia, which he said threatens the rules-based order. The rules-based order, of course, being the global regime under which nations must surrender sovereignty to the Western banks, financial institutions, and corporate cartels for the benefit of supposedly the world, but actually for the benefit of those cartels. Now, following Austin's just straight-out attack on China, we find there was a speech given by Republican Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, or Sasse, I guess, one of the more, I don't know what to say, contradictory Republicans. He was very much against Trump, but he's siding completely with the two-party strategy of war against Russia and China. In his speech, he said that the U.S. must move now with a new strategy because China represents, quote, the biggest threat to the American-led order, unquote. So here's what he proposed. 1, let's pass $1 trillion defense budget. It's close to $1 trillion now, but he's now saying, let's not worry about that. Let's go over that. Secondly, let's build a NATO for the Pacific. After praising NATO for its role in Europe and also the holding the line against the bloody Putin, he says Chairman Xi of China looks to expand his sphere of influence. So we need a new military alliance centered far out into the Pacific. This is our main foreign policy work, he said. So then he said, let us streamline our intelligence agencies so we can win a shadow war with the Chinese Communist Party. Next proposal. Let's arm the Taiwanese military to the teeth. Let's amend the Taiwan Relations Act directly to make our security guarantee explicit. No more strategic ambiguity. So in other words, throw out the treaty agreements that we have, the global agreements we have with China and other countries, to amend it to give us the capability to contain China by preparing for war. Then he says, let's pair military partnerships with economic partnerships. Pacific NATO should be a free trade zone too. This goes back to Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an exclusionary policy which was largely rejected by much of the Asian nations. When Biden was in Asia recently proposing a partnership for prosperity, it met with, at best, lukewarm response. Now, finally, here's what Sasse said. We built an American order that saw us through the Cold War. We can build a new American order that will see us through the coming conflict with the Beijing tyrant, unquote. So here you have it. Plans to continue the confrontation with Russia coming from the royals. At the same time, there are Americans who are proposing that we prepare for war with China. This is the war hawk mentality that exists within a security order, which is dangerous to every living being on the planet. That's why we need to have a new security architecture and a new financial architecture, which is going to be the topic for discussion at this coming online Schiller Institute conference this coming Saturday. I'm putting the link again at the bottom of the description page. Register for it, register your friends, become a part of our mobilization to move out of this world of dangerous lunacy into a world for cooperation, for peace and security.